So today we're going to talk about food chains and food webs in ecosystems. Food chains and food webs are similar, but they're not the same. Both food chains and food webs track how living things are connected to each other by the food they eat. They also track how energy flows in an ecosystem. Basically, we're looking at what eats what and how each being transfers energy into an ecosystem. So we're going to look at how these two things connect within an ecosystem today. Here we have two examples of food chains, and a food chain is a single connected path of energy flow through an ecosystem. It shows the different levels of eating within that ecosystem, essentially what eats what. And you see those arrows here? These arrows show that energy is flowing, and it shows where it flows from which organism to which organism in the ecosystem. And all ecosystems have food chains. Here's an example on the right from an ocean. And the one on the left shows the prairie. In order to understand food chains, we need to understand the different players in an ecosystem and look at how different species get their energy. So let's review the components in the ecosystem. First of all, let's recall that we have producers. These organisms, typically plants, are able to use the energy from the sun to make their own food in a process known as photosynthesis. So cool! They don't need to eat anything. They can produce everything they need to grow. So we call them producers because they produce their own food. Don't you wish you could make your own food? I do. Here we have a tree and grass that are producers. Next, we have consumers, which are any organisms that seek out and eat or consume other living things for food or energy. So consumers consume to get their energy. Also makes sense. Now these consumers are broken down into different categories based upon their place in the food chain and what they eat. So let's take a look at a food chain. The consumer eats first. They'll always eat a plant or a producer. That one is called a primary consumer. Primary means first, so first eater. Get it? In these food chains, we have a deer and a grasshopper as primary consumers. The consumer that eats the primary consumer is called a secondary consumer, or second eater. In these chains, we have a cougar and a fox who are secondary consumers, although they may be a different type of consumer if they eat other animals within the food chain, depending on when they eat. Food chains can also have tertiary and quaternary consumers who would be the third or fourth eaters in a food chain. Now we use arrows to show the flow of energy between the organisms. So, in this case, the plant would give energy to the deer, and the deer gives energy to the cougar, and that would be the top of that food chain, the end of it. In the next case, the grass gives energy to the grasshopper, and the grasshopper gives energy to the fox, the end of this food chain. A food chain only shows one pathway of energy in an ecosystem, and after that, there would either be scavengers that would eat the food, or they would decompose and begin the cycle again. Now, let's back up a minute and look at how energy travels through these food chains. If we look at this diagram, we can see that about 90% of the food's original energy is lost from level to level because animals must use their own energy to consume and digest their food. So at each stage, only 10% of the energy is passed on to the next level or consumer. If you look at the arrows moving from left to right, each arrow is smaller, indicating less energy transfer as you move through the food chain. Now, if we think about this energy in terms of a pyramid, we can see that it requires a lot of producers to sustain those top consumers in an ecosystem. In order to get enough energy to feed just that one owl, look at how many producers, primary and secondary consumers are consumed. See? Don't you wish you could make your own food? Now, on to food webs. Food chains show a simple connection between living things in an ecosystem. In reality, there are dozens, hundreds, or even thousands of food chains in an ecosystem. A food web shows how all food chains overlap and interact in the same ecosystem. If you link up all the possible food chains in an ecosystem, you get a food web. Now, if we look at these organisms, you may find them all in one ecosystem. So let's look at how our food webs may develop with these organisms. Let's look at our deer. Let's say he may eat leaves for breakfast. Perhaps another meal he eats grass, and maybe another day he eats seeds or nuts. He doesn't always want to eat the same thing. Do you? Of course not. Now, what would eat the deer? Well, in this diagram, that might be the cougar. Let's look at the grasshopper. Well, he would eat grass or leaves. He may be eaten by the bird or the fox. If we look at our little squirrel friend, he may dine on nuts or in hard times even the bark of the tree. Whom does he provide energy for? Well, in this ecosystem, he could be eaten by the hawk or the cougar or the fox. Poor little guy. So you get the picture. We have multiple food chains in a food web. That's what makes up a food web. Multiple food chains. Now there are lines everywhere. It's a big mess, but it makes sense that it'd be called a web. There's connections everywhere, and it is messy. Hence the term food web. So if you think of a food web, you can look here and you can see a producer. We have grass here. It's eaten by this deer, so that's our primary consumer. And we go up to the cougar, he's our secondary consumer. Here we have the producer here, which is the nuts, eaten by our primary consumer as a squirrel. And secondary consumer is either a vulture, or sometimes it could be eaten by a cougar as well. He would also be the secondary consumer. And here are our top predators in this food web. Remember, each chain is individual. So we think of tree, deer, cougar. That's our food chain. All of these chains connected together equal our food web for whatever ecosystem we're in. In this case, it would be a prairie ecosystem. So, food chains, food webs, a necessary part of every ecosystem.